Hey everyone, I'm Emily. Nice to see you again, if I have seen you before. Normally, when I'm up here in these videos, it's because I'm trying to push a product or tell you about a product or explain some mechanic or something like that for a thing that I've made in hopes of just kind of keeping interest. Rarely am I really kind of talking about myself or my personal experiences, mostly because I have a general assumption that they are not the thing that anybody's interested in hearing. But I'm coming up on a landmark birthday here in the next week, and I just want to talk a little bit about some things that I've learned and some things that I've done and experienced. And if you find those stories useful, then that's awesome. Otherwise, I guess it's just my opportunity to reflect a little bit as I go into this new chapter in my life. So there's a lot of stories to kind of reflect on, but I think I'm going to take this opportunity to talk about Hicks and Draconis' story and, by extension, my story as a designer, and some things that have led to where we are presently. And there's a lot of life reflections and life stories to be included in there too, but I don't need this video to be that long, and I'm sure the scale might be a little large. So the first edition of HSD released about 11 years ago, which means development on it began even before that. And that game had almost no feedback in it during the production process. I was an artist coming out of Tumblr, and by greater extension for Affinity at the time, with a modest following. That certainly helped a lot in terms of making me feel like I could do something, but I was in the midst of some pretty heavy depression, which was, I think, a good chunk of my life, and was looking for a change. I was trying pretty desperately to figure out some new niche that I could explore that might reflect the way that I felt, but I didn't really know how I felt. So I had played a lot of fantasy games. I was a little burnt out on fantasy. I was looking for science fiction. I thought it might reflect a little bit more the grittiness and a little bit more of the, I don't know, visceral quality, the kind of flesh and blood quality that I was kind of feeling at the time. I had all sorts of different feelings regarding body horror and elements of the fear of the unknown and things like that I thought science fiction would be a good place for. And I wanted to build a system. And I wanted to build a sandbox. I wanted to create a universe that a lot of people could kind of go into and play the games that they wanted to play in it. That was just sort of big and open. And I could kind of reflect on those games, see who it attracted, see what they played, see what they did, and maybe learn something about myself, which I think I've put this kind of story into another video before. I learned a lot mechanically about the creation of this game the first time through. One, I learned that if you don't have any degree of history in this space, getting playtesting is extraordinarily difficult. There was almost none that went into HSD 1.0, not because I didn't look for it, but because nobody wanted to step up for it. And that is a fully understandable circumstance. Tabletop games ask a lot, of people. You have to read the whole book. You have to set aside time to play it. You have to give up on the games that you're currently playing in order to set aside time to play it. There's no guarantee that this random person who's approaching you with a Word document manuscript that's 300 pages long is actually going to be trying to produce anything that is real or will ever hit a shelf or be sold or anything like that. Or, everybody knows somebody who said, I'm going to make a game, and they didn't actually get around to actually doing it, which is not to stop them from trying. I think everybody who says, I want to make a game should absolutely do their best to try. Have at it. It's just a reality that a lot of us don't end up finishing. So I built and I tested what few things I could with what few people would step up to that particular goal, and I had a lot of ideas and a lot of experiments and a lot of just things I wanted to try to kind of change the way that my experience of RPGs had played, to open up some new avenues that might make the game a little more varied or have some different approaches, very little of which I actually got the opportunity to try out and practice because of the aforementioned circumstances. And I learned a lot via this process. going through them, especially after the fact. And in a lot of ways, HSD1's release was its first major testing standpoint, which is why we moved on to 2. It wasn't because I necessarily desperately wanted to release another book. It was that there were a lot of things that I wanted to correct to build a better system, and I finally had people playing it that I could learn from. I also got to address probably my biggest regret. I mean, I don't even know if there's a probably in there, more or less my biggest regret about the entire system, which was just how I approached its story. And that was a situation that has kind of fogged HSD1's release for years at this point, and is entirely understandable and straight up a mistake, honestly. So when HSD1 launched, there were a lot of people that kind of looked at that game and said, this is some kind of libertarian paradise. This is a pro-capitalist manifesto trying to describe a better world where the Earth governments are dead and the corporations can run everything and everybody's happy for it. And I am here on the record for probably the 10th time saying that is not what was trying to be done there. But I also wanted to say, while I had this opportunity, that I do not blame people for coming to that conclusion. I fucked up the way that I approached. The idea there, as has been mentioned in the past, was to produce a story where there was a kind of read into it subtlety, where you were being given a sugar-coated recollection of history by somebody who had drank the Kool-Aid. You were given an unfaithful narrator who was delivering the party line. And as you kind of went through the book, you could see evidence of how many of the stories didn't add up, how many of the circumstances weren't actually producing anything good, but were being called good. Look at this wonderful outcome, and you'd look at that and be like, this outcome isn't wonderful at all. What are you talking about? It was to kind of project the idea that if things continued down the path that they're currently on, people won't even know how bad they are, which is the thing that we see in reality all the time. There are many people who do know how bad things are, but there are all sorts of people living in terrible situations who just kind of think that's the way it is. And that was sort of like the energy that was supposed to be delivered by the first book. I am a queer woman with a chronic illness that has been fucked around by insurance companies her entire life. I guarantee you, I am not pro-corporate. But what I was inexperienced in writing and inexperienced in trying to deliver these messages, and I was asking too much of the audience. I had not realized at that particular stage that it is kind of incorrect to expect anybody to go through an entire manuscript and give it the benefit of the doubt till the end before they make a decision. That the concept of don't judge a book by its cover is a luxury and a privilege granted to those who have the ability to wait that long before they know if somebody is actually on their side or is actively out to harm them. I wanted to kind of create this sort of subtle reveal story that was going to make people think, oh, I want to dig into this universe and I want to find out a little bit more about what is actually going on under the surface here. And while that is a fun idea, what it accomplishes is creating a front-loaded bulwark where it just looks as though it's trying to pitch an idea that it's not actually trying to pitch. And that put a lot of people off, and I'm here to say that is entirely understandable, and that I wish I had approached it a different way. I thought that result was going to be different than it was. And when I eventually got around to making Sound and Silence, I tried to lay out a lot clearer what the actual circumstances were of the universe. I think it made it a lot more visible, and certainly in second edition, when we moved on to there, a lot of that concept of the unfaithful narrator just kind of goes away. And you get a story that is a lot more kind of top-down, where you can just see more of the lapses of privacy, the invasions of spaces, the absolute control that these corporations have over the people, and the complete lack of options that they have available to them. And how the only walks of life that appear to be available are as some kind of pawn for these industries. And if you don't, play by the rules, you don't have a space in society, which is very much the circumstance we look at today. And that was largely the point of sort of that particular segment of HSD's story, was just kind of demonstrate that we are already on a pathway that is pretty shitty, and in many ways, a lot of the stuff that you see here is only getting worse. As I've kind of moved forward in various development and just writing styles and things that I've tried to do, I have attempted to make that more and more just transparent, so that I can hopefully not lose the folks that are because it was a regrettable result. It wasn't what I wanted. And I certainly, noticed that there were a crowd of people who were approaching my Discord and showing up in my spaces that were displaying, centrist ideals or libertarian ideals, or just kind of thoughts about how much better this was going to be. And as I kind of witnessed these things, we started shoveling them out there, because I was like, this was not the this was not the vibe, not what we were looking for here at all. And now, some 11 years later, as I'm writing Gallery, which is a story that has many different themes about both kind of being queer, being trans, and also trying to fight against just large organizations who have arbitrarily decided about the moral wrongness of those beings. There's just fully a segment in the front of the book being like, hey, this is what this is saying, and this is what this is for, so that we don't kind of end up in a situation like the last one, where people have to kind of drag themselves through 80 pages of lore to find the story underneath, while in the meantime they're having to just give the book credit for eventually getting there. I don't think that's fair to readers, and I think that was a mistaken approach. The body horror and astral horror elements of HSD were touching on a few different feelings. Obviously, they were touching very heavily on dysphoria, and I didn't even know it. I came out, has it been 5 years? It's been 4 at least. It's 4 to 5, somewhere in there, ago. And obviously I wrote HSD 11 years ago, if not earlier, depending on how far back you track development. I had a lot of feelings in there that I didn't understand, and a lot of them work their way into the various surgical aspects, or even the transcendent aspects of just kind of like, certainly in the character creation aspects, the huge array of different available bodies was intended to kind of convey this idea of, be who you want and have that be meaningful. I wanted to reflect what those choices would mean in game, so that people who wanted to craft their bodies could get kind of meaningful results out of it. One of the things that I really loved about the furry fandom is just the diversity of form that exists within it. And I thought it would be really fun to have a game that allowed you to really embrace that diversity of form. Which has been met with mixed results. I think a lot of people are very happy with it. I've gotten some really funny comments from time to time about folks that have very specific biases about very specific bodies. I remember I was at a convention once, and I just had the book out. I wasn't claiming it or anything like that. It was just next to me on a table. I was playing 40K, I think, or War Machine or something like that. And it was just next to me, and somebody came up and was looking through it, and they had seen it before. They knew what it was, and they were just kind of talking about it a little bit. I was just listening. I hadn't said anything other than being like, oh, you've heard of it? Cool. What do you think? Stuff like that. And they were like, yeah, I like it. I really like the character options, and you can be all these different things, but like, some of it's pretty goofy. Some of it doesn't make any sense. And I was like, okay, sure. What? This is first edition time. Like, they're like, what was it that you were, what did you say? And they're like, micros. Like that's like. I mean, that's just silly. That's just. And I was over here just kind of smirking, like that's what you picked. The small folks. That was the part that did it for you. And it's just, it was just kind of funny, because like I don't mind the comment. It's a fanciful environment. There are all kinds of things that don't make sense in HSD. I just thought it was really funny that the one thing that threw this person's suspension of disbelief was that there were, very tiny critters in it. not any of the other stuff. Clearly somebody just doesn't like micros very much. But the game gave me an opportunity to write out a whole bunch of ideas and feelings in the forms of various surgeries and abilities that I could then later refine and try to work into its world a little bit, which I think Sound and Silence helped a lot with. As a dedicated lore book, that was the first time that I got to sit there and really try to write the universe a little bit, as well as hopefully address some of the mistakes that were written earlier. Um, and that was a fun one to write. It's not a book that I revisit very often, mostly because it isn't entirely a lore book. But it was a neat spot for me to get into the universe from the standpoint of somebody who had finally seen people react to it. Because again, during HSD1, I didn't really have much in the way of feedback. At this point, for Sound and Silence, I did finally have some feedback. I had learned a lot of stuff about what it was that people wanted to see, and had some very kind of sad moments in terms of I wish I had conveyed this better. But I got to kind of address some of that in that book, which of course brings us to a second issue with game design, or any product design really, which is if you burn somebody on the first impression, it's rare that they come back. So despite numerous efforts to attempt to kind of correct this issue, there are some folks who are still operating off of what they saw within the first few pages of a product 11 years ago. And again, I can't blame them for that. They are not obligated to try this again. I would just like to believe that I could possibly fix it in some way. When we wrote Sound and Silence, I got to get some really beautiful art for that book, and the help of some really great supporters, and moved into second edition after that, which second edition is going on 7 years at this point. Feels like a long time. I've been very pleased with how second edition is run. And in light of the fact that I don't have a production company, and I don't have people working for me, and I don't have additional writers or anything like that, it's sort of unlikely that we'll ever get a third. Could it benefit from a third? Yeah, probably, especially as I'm writing Gallery. There's all sorts of stuff that I've stripped out of second ed that to build Gallery that I think just make the game run a little bit smoother. But they also just make it different. Gallery is a much less crunchy game. It's really just kind of not concerned with the same things that HSD is concerned with. HSD is intended to be a little crunchy. That was a thing that was sort of always part of it. I could have made a lighter system. I certainly was in my capabilities to do so, but I didn't necessarily want to. I like a little crunch. I like a bit of build. I come from a wargaming background, and it's fun to put items together and figure out what they do and which combos can come with them, and I didn't want to lose that from HSD. But it's not necessarily what I wanted to convey in Gallery, so Gallery just has a lot less of that. But yeah, as we got into second edition, I have been very pleased. It was a game that I had a lot more help with. I had a whole group that just did an amazing job of playtesting it for a very long time, and I have been out of touch with them for a minute because some pretty rough shit happened to me toward the end of that whole era, and I lost touch with a lot of people. And that's unfortunate because they're wonderful people, and they did an amazing job at making that game possible. But I wrote it, released it, and I had really hoped that I could make a career out of it, and ultimately, as things kind of fell apart in various other ways, as my dysphoria was leading to depression that was just sort of unconquerable, and I was just fading from existence. A lot of stuff just kind of fell by the wayside there. I was working on HSD Mastered for a while, and had really planned on having that book finished before launching the Kickstarter, having it completely done. And then a really big event happened in my life, and I kind of discovered what it was that had been so fucked for so many years. And I spent many months kind of trying to figure out what I was going to do about that before I couldn't sleep anymore, and I couldn't function anymore, and I came out. And there's a lot of details that kind of came with that, but ultimately what it led to was a kind of life reset. My marriage ended, and I needed to find a new place to live, and I was very worried about losing my child, who was born around the time that first edition released. And I was very worried that I wasn't going to be able to stay in California. and that would lead to a life for her that would kind of mimic what my own was. I was also a child of a divorce that had to. I was in the era where they had unaccompanied minors on planes, so I was flying back and forth to different families that were on opposite ends of the state, and it has led to just a host of really horrible mental issues, amongst various other things. I'm not blaming that exclusively. But I was very concerned, and there was a lot of spiraling that kind of took place during that area, and I had to launch that Kickstarter for Mastered prematurely because I needed the money, or I wasn't going to be able to find a place to live. So it was kind of, we need this to go through now, or shit's going to get real bad real quick. And then the hope was always to wrap it up quickly, but I discovered with full-time work and childcare and trying to be a single parent, and also trying to build a new life for myself, going through puberty a second time, many things just didn't work the way they used to work. There's a circumstance that happens, I think, to a lot of people as they go through the transition process and begin just kind of restructuring their lives, where a lot of the skills that you have available to you prior just kind of like seem to vanish. They seem to be untouchable. And there's neat research behind that. They're locked behind, just pathways that are forged through various physical behavior or mental behavior. And in the case of mine, I kind of create most often when I'm sad. And pre-transition, there was a lot of disassociation, just tons of disassociation that I would often write in, channeling some of those feelings. And a lot of that kind of went away after transition. And with it went the ability to concentrate on that sort of thing. Also, there was just kind of like life focuses that got in the way, which made it take a really long time to fulfill that particular Kickstarter, of which I was very sad about, but could not get it to work. I would sit there in front of the computer just frustrated as all hell, or unable to type a line, or find the energy, or find the time to try to make any of that work while also just existing in that moment. And it took quite a while before I managed to get that back. It was kind of like kicking and screaming back to finding some of those skills again. Then eventually we did, and Master got finished, and I was pretty happy with it. I think it's a pretty neat book. I think it accomplishes most of what it was trying to do. The artwork is really beautiful throughout that, and then it kind of faded out during the monster section because there just wasn't any money. No money left. And then I got burned off of some freaking a stock image site. I've used stock images for the books before. This is nothing, hidden about that. But up to that point, stock images were images that were created by artists and then put up for sale for use in various projects. So I bought a commercial license and I used them because that's what they were for. At the point that was coming online, AI images were starting to hit the fore, and I just wasn't aware of it. I didn't know how to spot them. I couldn't necessarily pick out the difference between an AI generated image and somebody's somewhat, quick and dirty done a 3D model. And I was trying to collect images in a hurry and ended up buying a bunch of stock art that was not actually stock art. So there was a situation there in early publication where a bunch of images got in that book that were fully computer generated with no humans behind them, and I was not pleased to see that happened. So subsequently, the original version of that book got taken off a drive-through, and I pulled all those images out before re-uploading it. And I think that's probably only going to get worse. I've kind of gotten off of using stock images at this point because I can't trust them. There's no guarantee that those are actually made by a person anymore. But artwork faux pas beside, the new material I think was beautiful, and I think runs rather well if you're willing to let it run and be the thing that it's going to be. Which led us to kind of the end of the HSD trifecta. There we had a lore book, we had a core rule book, and we had kind of a DMG/monster manual. That kind of wrapped it all up into a neat little bow of a triple box set that I one day hope to make. Maybe at the time that I do that, I'll be able to go in there and modify things even further, but it's all time that I don't necessarily think exists. Which brings us to now. Visitor. We have a kitty. Yeah, which brings us to now. So I have a lapse in employment presently that is giving me the opportunity to work on Gallery, which is a project that I've had in mind since before even coming out. And as I was kind of getting to the edges of it and beginning to realize sort of what was going on in my life, if HSD was written as this kind of environment where it was cold and alone and lost and groping for hope and community in a place that really just doesn't want you to thrive, Gallery is intended to be the story about thriving in a place that actually still doesn't necessarily want you to, but that you actually have the power to beat. It is a game about personal agency. It's a game about the ability to mold yourself, and it is written from a more personal spot in my actual experiences than HSD was, which I would not normally write about, didn't write about at the time. But I have come to realize that my experiences were not quite so abnormal, and that there are people out there who identify with them, and I wanted to create a space for them. You are right in front of the camera, or you're gonna be as you walk across that desk. And I wanted to create a game that kind of encapsulated those. It's been a lot of fun and very cathartic to make. I have only been able to do it because I had this sort of time between jobs. Unfortunately, we are coming to the end of how much time it's possible to have to do this sort of thing. I am in rather desperate need of income and have been looking for some time to get it, but you all know the job market right now and this hellscape that we exist in. So my goal is to put out Gallery in the best condition that it can possibly be. And it will, unless it does just astronomically well, that will probably be the only edition of it, that exists until some date just way further down the line, if my financial circumstances have changed. I still want to make adventures for them. The adventures, the little books, they don't take as much time to make. They can kind of still be done. But big tomes like this, large books, they're difficult to do in my current circumstances. By difficult, I mean generally impossible if I've got other full-time work going on, which is a statement on its own of the horrors of our hyper-capitalist landscape and how they do not allow people to express. In the end, the hope with any of these projects and any of the games that I make and any of the franchises or worlds or other things that I developed is to create an environment where people can find themselves and find joy and escapism or recognition or just kind of the feeling of being seen. Something in these spots that speak to them. I'm not just building system with these, I'm trying to build stories. Gallery is filled with stories. HSD, and mostly in the contracts, is filled with stories. To try to create a spot where people can feel more comfortable and have some security in the knowledge that somebody else has felt the way that they felt. It is an attempt at communication, and I do it because I like to tell stories, and because I want to connect with people. There's a certain irony to that because I honestly don't necessarily get to connect with very many people in these. It's a lot of kind of development, and I don't really get to play them very often. There's no time for one. I have test games that I run, and I can occasionally watch other people play. But that's kind of all I've got. I've got too much that I need to do otherwise. But the hope out there is that it helps somebody. And as I round off my 4th decade on this earth, I have this surreal experience of feeling like I'm 5 years old, having kind of started over in a lot of different ways. And it was a just hugely important circumstance that has given me a second lease on a life that I can actually love, but it has left a lot of living behind. It's kind of tough to start this far along. And I'm not even as far along as many people end up having to start. And it is never too late. But that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. It doesn't mean that there isn't a feeling of loss that comes with that. That is both emotional and just very literal. You lose connections. You lose history. There are people I can't contact now. There are job experiences that I can't cite. There are all sorts of different things that kind of step between me and the traditional metrics for success. And I work with them because that's what I've got. Some of those feelings are kind of encapsulated in Gallery. Not because it's trying to make some kind of value statement or something like that. I think that is a completely fallacious way to kind of go into anything regarding the trans experience, or any trans experience is to try to weigh it on a metric. That's not what it is. But rather because the joy, the liberation, the amazing things that you find with this, they are cataloged very successfully in a lot of different properties, and they're in here too. And I think that those are wonderful things to have on display. But the full spectrum of emotion is part of this, and I don't necessarily see as many that touch on some of those hurts and some of the things that are some of the longing, some of the things that become so much closer but still out of reach, and even reveal that they are reachable in certain circumstances. Gallery is trying to grab a lot of full spectrum emotion in one spot, and I hope that the stories that are laid within resonate with its player base. There's a sort of unfortunate circumstance that comes out of any kind of tabletop game design where the stories that you write are a part of you, as they are with any authorship. They don't mean any less to me than a novel does. They don't. They are not attempted to be cheap or simple in any particular way. But they're not really given the same kind of gravity as some of those other media types are, in terms of the thought that's put into them. And I would like to believe that there will be a whole host of different gamers that are reading this and being like, I see myself in these pages. Because ultimately that's where I found myself, was in various media that people had put down, whether they were simple tweets or stories that I witnessed in play, or even just kind of stumbled across bit by bit. The vision of what I was missing came into focus because other people decided to speak. And I want to be somebody who speaks. The unfortunate reality is that some of those messages will come across wrong or be lost or misinterpreted, and occasionally, I can look at somebody and be like, you really kind of read into that wrong, and occasionally it's because it's fully my fault and I just didn't do a good job, because I'm human and I have the experiences that I have, and I do the best I can with them. But bit by bit over time we get better. We learn from the previous attempts, and it is my esteemed hope that this far along in this process I have created a stronger approach than my first one over a decade ago. I have no specific ending to deliver on this particular spiel. I don't even know if anybody will watch this video. I just rarely sit down and talk about these experiences from a development standpoint. And I figured I should, because if you don't, nobody ever hears them.